Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender, where we take a deep dive into the most important economic issues facing agriculture. I'm your host, Carly Jacobson. Again, we have David Widmar and Brent Gloy back here with us from Agricultural Economic Insights, along with our own Grant Dixon, who is out of McCook, Nebraska. So, during a time when we could be talking about wars, inflation, interest rates, we're actually intentionally not today. Today, we're going to ground ourselves back into the things that we can control and actions that we can take. Doesn't mean we don't want to ever talk about those, but today we're going to talk about having a vision for the future and setting goals. So, and for most of us, that's not really the hard part. In fact, if you're like me, it's breaking down the goals into actionable steps that can really get me into trouble. Even when I do that, sometimes I lack the accountability to make it happen when the going gets tough. So today we're going to look at the tips and tricks for converting goals to plans and ultimately results. And with that, Brent, let me kick this over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Carly, and thanks for sharing that. It's good to know that I'm not the only one that struggles with getting the goals turned into action all the time, and I think a lot of us can relate to that. Let's go ahead and get started on goals to plans. And as Carly said, there's a lot of global events happening right now, and David and I have been doing webinars on these things and are up to speed on a lot of that stuff. So if you want to ask those questions too, you can ask them in the overtime. But in some ways, I think it's a good illustration, as Carly said, is that we tend to sometimes get distracted by things that are outside of our control and forget to work on the things that we really can control. And one of the most important things you can do is prioritizing your efforts. And we all know that we have scarce resources, and those two scarce resources for almost all of us are time and capital. And how you decide to allocate your time and your capital are going to have a huge impact on how your business goes and your personal life and all those other kinds of things, how that evolves over time. And it's really important to stop and think a little bit about how we allocate both of those resources. And I know from my own perspective, the time allocation is probably one of the hardest things that we have to do. Are we spending our time wisely and on things that matter? Are we always finding ourselves busy and frazzled or bored? I think is the other indication about how you're allocating your time. But it's really important to kind of reflect on that. And one of the things we can do to help with that is thinking about our goals and our priorities. And we all know that there's lots of conflicting priorities that we face in our life. There's personal things we have to do. There's things associated with our business. And then we have kind of the issue of, what am I going to do today versus what am I going to get done in a week versus what do I hope to accomplish over the year. And I firmly believe that we spend some time thinking about how to organize ourselves and our business. We can do better at those things. And the other thing that setting goals and prioritizing your efforts helps with is it really helps to measure our progress and our success. So if we have some goals of accomplishing certain things, we can use those to help and measure and determine, hey, are we achieving what we hope to achieve? Are we making it to where we want to? And if we're not, what are some things we can do to modify that? So I think it's useful for all kinds of reasons. Now, the thing that I think trips a lot of us up is that, I think this old quote, and we have David found someone to attribute this quote to. I thought it was a Chinese proverb or something, but we've all heard it. And a goal without a plan is just a wish. And I think that's very true, So we have to have a plan for achieving those goals, but it's really important to start with something, a good goal. And I think most of us have heard the old idea of a SMART goal. And yeah, it's an old idea, but part of the reason it's an old idea and it's made it this long is it's a pretty good one. And you want to start when you're setting your goals with something that's specific. Is it clear for everybody? And just to give you an example, you say, well, I want to be financially successful. Well, that's not really a very specific goal. It doesn't really say very much. It's not measurable. How will we know if we achieve it or not? So we want to start with something that's more specific. Like, for instance, I want to achieve a certain level of working capital in my business. That's specific. It's measurable. We can know whether we get there or not. We want to think and understand, is that goal achievable? And there's a fine line there between setting goals that are stretch goals that make us work, versus ones that aren't achievable at all, versus ones that they're too easily achieved. And so I think we want to think, as we're saying those goals, is this something that's actually achievable? Is it one we want to accomplish? Because I will say too, goals are powerful. When we set goals, that we have a way of moving toward them. So we want to make sure we're setting the right goal. And then, is it relevant? Does it fit into the big picture? Is it really an important goal? And is it timely? What's the time horizon we're talking about? So I think all of those things help us develop goals that are useful for us going forward. And that's going to be really important as we get into how to get a plan to achieve those goals.
So the second part of this, or the next part of this that I'll speak to a little bit to, is thinking a little bit about the kinds of goals that we might want to set for our operation. And we've outlined 3 key areas. And I think this is helpful because it helps us think about, what the types of goals we're missing, or the types of goals that we want to put into place. So the first area here that I want to talk about is long-term versus short-term goals. Typically speaking, those long-term goals are more strategic in nature. They're more of this big picture. They might tie in with our values. And so they might transcend generations. And so these are very important to maybe a starting point. We might start with those, but they're very important to, again, get those as close to a SMART goal and as specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, relevant, and timely as possible. And then the next layer here are short-term goals. And short-term goals are often built around key business metrics or key business functions, and they oftentimes support our efforts towards those strategic or long-term goals. Another area to think about are goals built around the areas of our business. And so think about your business plan and how you've broken down your business plan, or the different areas of your business that your revenues or your expense categories. But you can also think about, production-based goals. Maybe you have a yield goal. Maybe you have a revenue goal on a per head or per acre basis. Maybe you have goals around your calving program or your feedlot rates of gains. Those are very common. In fact, we probably are very quick to come up with these especially around yield, right? Everyone thinks about yield really quickly. The next area are maybe marketing goals. What kind of marketing plan do we have? What are the goals that are associated with this plan, both short-term and long-term? Another area are financial or capital goals, thinking about the balance sheet. A lot of benchmarking actually takes place around the balance sheet. And so that's one area. Maybe you have a CapEx plan, CapEx goals that you want to achieve. And then you can also work this all the way down into labor or risk management plans. And as you can see, this could continue to go as your business, as it fits your business. And the third area here are outcome versus input goals. A lot of times we think about outcome-based goals, such as a yield goal would be an output-based goal. Or, for example, I want to achieve $100,000 in family living that I can then use to support my family. That's an outcome goal. And that goal itself isn't one that we have a lot of control over. So in often cases, we need to put input goals around that or underneath it, nested as part of it, to help us achieve that. So if you have an income farm family living goal, you can start to think about, okay, what is it that I can do? It's a goal that I can accomplish in the next month or the next year that's going to help me achieve that outcome goal.
David, you and I talk about this a lot. Just personally, a blank piece of paper is often the hardest thing to overcome, and it can be really intimidating. But one of the things you can do is, take out 5 blank pieces of paper and write production at the top of one, marketing at the top of another, finance, labor, etc. All the areas you want to have goals, and then just start working toward developing some goals in each one of those areas and thinking about, okay, is this the goal? And then kind of ask yourself the why question several times and the how question. How are we going to achieve it, to help start build that plan to implement and achieve your goals?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think a lot of times we need to draft these goals. We need to sort of work with them, set with them, and get off that top dead center, which is often the blank page. On the next piece here, we want to talk a little bit about a few examples of how goals might play out in your conversations or in your farm. And the goal for this first example is to illustrate how goals will vary across operations. And so something that seems sort of easy for someone to think about is maybe the next generation. That's something that a lot of us are going to face. And so it might seem like, oh, we could go to a web page and we can download a list of goals for an operation that wants to transition to the next generation. And I just want to spend just a couple minutes working through this flow chart to show how it's going to quickly evolve and change based on your operations needs. So if we go to the left here, there's one question here is, are you retiring soon? Or to the right, are you going to be co-managing this operation with the next generation for a while? And as you can see, as Brent mentioned, it asks the how and the why question several times to get down, drill this down a little bit. If you're retiring soon, a few key considerations might be around transferring assets or the transitioning of that decision-making process. So as underneath there, you could start to think about all the different types of goals that you might have to build that help you have a successful transfer of assets and help you have a successful transitioning of decision-making. And as you can imagine, your farm and your situation has a unique set of assets, and you have a unique set of decision-making processes, and the next generation has a unique set of transitioning decision-making attributes. So as you can see, this becomes very specific to your operation. It becomes very personal, and it can become very uncomfortable very quickly. And so something that even seems high level, like transition plans, can become very, very specific very quickly. And we have to be willing to go into that. On the other side, if you want to co-manage this, maybe you have goals around how you're going to share responsibilities, how you're going to grow the business. What are those business growth goals? Do you want to expand the current operation, or are you going to spin out a different little entity or a different little business model or a different revenue stream to help you make progress towards those goals? And so spend some time thinking about this and how your goals could be very unique and very specific to your situation, how that can actually change over time. But you just need to be very careful to not carbon copy somebody else's goals for their transition plan, or let somebody else tell you exactly how they did it, because it's going to be unique to your operation. The second example here I want to spend just a few minutes with is something that Brent and I think a lot about as economists and people who spend a lot of time on budgets, is how we can transition a goal and actually start to put it in our budgets. So the goal here is improving the balance sheet position by increasing working capital by $200,000 in 3 years. And we had a previous Two Economists and a Lender session where we talked about working capital, and one of the things we talked about is thinking about goals to how you could build that. So we want to spend a little bit of time thinking about this from the goal perspective. And one of the first things you can think about is, we talked about in the SMART elements of this. Is it timely? Is it achievable? Well, how feasible is this? And if we have good sets of historic budget performance or return performance, if we have a good set of budgets available for 2022, we can start to pencil this in. Okay, how feasible is it to me to increase my working capital by $100 per acre per year over a 3-year process? And if that doesn't necessarily fit in right away to your budgets, you can start to think about, okay, what are some of the trade-offs that I could make? Maybe I'm going to hold back on family living a little bit. Maybe I'm going to defer some capital purchases. Maybe I want to revisit some of my other goals that I have. How do I want to make sure that I can make progress towards this? The second piece here is an idea that Brent and I refer to as know your costs. Everyone says producers need to know their costs, but in a lot of ways, there are different cost measures. So there can be economic costs, there can be cash flow break-evens, and this other cost category will challenge you to think about is what's your break-even cost for your goals. And so if you have a goal to increase working capital by $100 per acre per year for the next 3 years, pencil that into your budgets. And what's really interesting and really powerful in your decision-making process is maybe a year like 2021 or 2022 when commodity prices are favorable and there's a profitable cash flow opportunity out there. It takes some of the angst around marketing your grain whenever you're trying to figure out, well, is it going to go higher from here? Well, if you have those goals penciled into a budget, you can now step back and say, okay, yes, I can make a little bit of a profit here, and I can make a lot of progress towards these goals that I'm building out. And you might find a year like 2021, you can make 2 or 3 years worth of progress towards some of these goals. And that's a really powerful way for you to think about it. And finally, what goals can be added to keep us on track? A lot of cases, this top goal that I mentioned, it's going to start to you're going to start thinking about new goals that you can layer in underneath. So I like to say goals beget goals, right? So this idea of when you start with a good goal, you're going to continue to find other goals that are going to help you move towards that along the way. So to wrap this section up before we get to our lender expert grant this month, I want to share a few final thoughts here. The first one Brent and I have for you is to start simple. A lot of times when we talk about knowing your cost of production or knowing your farm machinery cost, this idea is how do you go from 0 to 60? And the way you do that is you make slow increments. I think one of the intimidating parts about setting goals is you quickly step back and say, oh my gosh, like these are goals that are going to take me forever to get to, or I don't have enough information to know if this goal is attainable or realistic. And the idea here is to start simple. Rome wasn't built in a day, and so we need to make sure that we can just get on that process, get started, and we can improve our process over time. As Brent likes to remind me, don't let great be the enemy of good, right? We want to make sure that we are making progress and we don't get overwhelmed by the best case scenario, or the aspirational parts of this, where we could be 10 or 15 years from now. Second point is don't let others define your goals, and don't let your business goals define you and your family. It's really important that these goals that you put together, you recognize that everybody around the table is going to have different personal goals. And you need to recognize where there's maybe disconnect, or where there's overlap, or where there's some gaps in between there. And second of all, we want to make sure that everyone understands the business goals and that they all are relevant and they match up. There's some alignment between those business goals and their personal goals. And I think, as I mentioned before, one of the more dangerous things is just to hear somebody else share their goals at the coffee shop or at a presentation or at a conference, and you take their goals and adopt them for your own. That could be a recipe for challenges, because as Brent said, goals have a way we sort of move towards those goals, and we might end up moving in a direction that we don't want to go. And finally, point 3 here is how will you share your goals? This is actually a conversation that, as we were preparing this, we spent a lot of time scratching our heads a little about this. Sharing your goals is really powerful. It can help build accountability. You can unlock some really powerful discussions. Chance favors the prepared mind. So if you're able to share your goals, maybe your lender or maybe your neighbor or maybe a stakeholder in your operation can help you think about an opportunity or a challenge or a hurdle. That can be really powerful. But we also got to think about the role of trust. And what are some reasons why you wouldn't want to share goals? What are some of the goals that you're comfortable sharing? And maybe what are some of the goals that you're uncomfortable sharing? And I think that's a really important thing to at least consider at the outset.
And David, I think to kind of summarize all that, I always think back to that stupid movie Groundhog Day, and the lead character always going to the psychiatrist and always telling him, take baby steps. And baby steps are really powerful because they get you started. And too often we didn't want to show you all these big implementation schemes today because it can be really intimidating. And I saw somebody talk about their business a couple months ago, and he talked about their planning process and their goal setting and all this kind of stuff. And my thought was, man, that's really intimidating. And it's intimidating because they're so far down the path, and it's hard to see how you can get from where you are to the end point. But it's a process, and I guarantee if you do this, it will have start setting goals, work toward implementing. It will have a profound impact on your business. I just am super confident that this is one of the things you can do that will really improve your business in the long run. And like David said, don't let great be the enemy of good.
So there are three ideas or resources here that we will share. As you go down that journey, as Brent talked about, is taking good and getting better over time. Three ideas to think about. One of them is anti-goals, and I find it personally interesting to say it's hard for me to define what this goal is, but I know what I don't want to be, right? Maybe I don't ever want to raise livestock, or maybe I don't ever want to do custom hire. Maybe I don't ever want to raise dry land corn. Well, if you start with some anti-goals, you can put some things into place to help you stay away from these areas that you don't want to end up. Another area is the balanced scorecard. I know there's a lot of resources around there that you can look up and incorporate as you work to improve. And finally, a book that we'll mention is Scaling Up. It can definitely help you think about alignment between those long-term goals and those actions that you're doing on a regular basis. So at this point, we're going to introduce our lender expert, Grant Dixon. He has been really instrumental as we prepared for this. So Grant, it's great to have you joining us today. Thank you so much for all your help along the way and for helping us out today. You're going to stick around for the overtime, so make sure everybody gets those overtime questions around goals and planning, but also anything else that's on your mind this month. So Grant, to kick this off, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a great opportunity here to be able to share some of my knowledge and what I've learned over the past 14 years here. So grew up in Southwest Nebraska near a little town called Juanita. Went to Fort Hays State University, got my bachelor's in ag business there. And after that, I had interned a couple of summers for Farm Credit Services of America, once as an ag direct intern and once as a financial officer intern in Lincoln. And after that, had an opportunity to move to Harlan, Iowa. Started my career there as a financial officer. Was there 8 years, met a lot of great people, was able to help a lot of operations grow and achieve their goals. And about 6 years ago, had the opportunity to move home here. So moved back to McCook, is where we live now. So I work with a lot of producers here in the Southwest Nebraska area, and live here with my family, my wife Amanda, and 3 kids, Jason, Kenna, and Henley, and involved in production agriculture on a daily basis with my dad. Raise corn and wheat, and I have a small cow herd myself, so stay pretty busy.
I think it's your diversity in both geography, but also the demographics that you've covered in your career and even your personal life makes this conversation really valuable. So I want to kick this off by revisiting the SMART goal ideas that Brent walked us through. I'm curious, what have you seen that producers typically struggle with the most?
You guys have done a pretty good job hammering it home, but it's start small. It's kind of the theory of how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time, that kind of theory, I think. A lot of producers struggle with knowing where to even start. It's just intimidating to know how big a goals to set for yourself or how broad you need to do to set those goals. The attainable piece, that one's probably one that sticks out to me the most. When you set goals, you don't want to short yourself, obviously, and make them too easy. But at the same time, you don't want to set a goal that isn't achievable either. Being the broad geography that I've worked across, if you're out here in Southwest Nebraska and you set a goal to raise 130 bushel dryland corn, it might be attainable, but it might be something that's pretty tough for you to reach. So you don't want to get frustrated with goals that you can't achieve and get burnt out that way. So that would be a little bit of advice I would give, is to make sure you start small and attainable.
So oftentimes we associate goals with growth, maybe growth in our business, and you challenge us to think a little bit more broadly than just growth related goals. So can you explain that just a little bit?
Yeah, right. The first thing when everybody thinks about when you talk about goals is like growth and getting bigger and all that. So you've heard the quote before, sometimes better is better before bigger is better. So what areas can you focus on in your operation that you can get better at? Ultimately, your goal might be growth at the end of the day, but what are the smaller goals that you should work on to help yourself attain that growth? maybe you need to focus on a goal that's around profitability or understanding your cost of production, or finding people on your team or that can help you out, I guess, into achieving those goals. You want to make sure that you have the right people in the right places in achieving those goals. And like you said, everybody's in a different stage in their operation. If you're young and beginning, your goal might be growth. If you're towards the end of the road and your goal is transition to the next generation and the family, everybody's goals are going to be quite a bit different. So it's not just always about growth, and you just have to make sure that you're headed the right direction.
Can there be such a thing as a bad goal?
The ones that you don't pursue, those are, that's a bad goal, is one that you set and then you don't work towards, I think. But there again, it just depends on the situation and where you're at in life and what you want to accomplish. I don't think that there are any bad goals. I think there's probably just poorly defined goals. So you just want to make sure, I guess, that the goals are relevant to you. That's part of the SMART goals, is, are they relevant? If it doesn't fit you, don't put it into and try to put it into action. Just like you hear a speaker or someone talk about their goals, that might not be the ones that you need to take home and put into action. So you just want to make sure that they fit you.
Could you tell us a little bit about some of the risks associated with the goals that we're pursuing, or maybe some of the roadblocks that could stand in our way, and how you've had conversation with producers to help unlock those insights?
Yeah, one of the risks, I think, is you want to make sure that your family and that your stakeholders that are involved in your operation, that they're all on board, or that they aren't adversely affected. Your goals might not line up with everybody else that's on your team. So you want to make sure that you communicate that with them and that everyone's on the same page. Jokingly, I might say, well, you might have goals that your lender might be able to help you achieve, but maybe it might affect another stakeholder down the road. It might cause troubles in other areas of your business. So you just want to make sure that everybody's on board and that you communicate your goals and visit with the people that are affected and make sure that they're on board too. And if they're not, then you should make adjustments and plan accordingly. So,
in preparing this, you shared an example of a conversation you had with a farm team. Can you elaborate a little bit on that today?
Yeah. So it's all about communication, right? You want to make sure that you're open and communicate with everyone that's involved. It's kind of like walking into the dealership and the salesman tries to sell you this blaze red Corvette, right? When all you actually need is a 3/4 ton work pickup. You want to communicate to them what your needs are. So I guess the communication part, where I'm going with that is, I had an example here a while back. I was standing in a farm shop with a father and a son operation. And the father was asking me about life insurance and whether or not he needed it, or whether I thought that maybe it was a good idea. And I said, well, you've got to tell me more about where you're going with this, or why you think it's important. And he said, well, I guess while we're all standing here, we might as well just get it out in the open and talk about it. So we ended up having a pretty good conversation about the transition and the estate planning and how it was going to affect the son and how things were going to be set up. And prior to that time, that conversation between the father and the son hadn't happened. So I would assume that the son is guessing on how the operation is going to transition to him, and the father's doing the same. So I guess at the end of the day, I ended up being the catalyst or the conduit that made that conversation come alive. And I think at the end of the day, everyone felt better that we all knew where the operation was headed in the future and how it was all going to play out. So that was kind of fun to be able to help them communicate and to be able to, I guess, tell what each party was excited about for the future and where they wanted to get to with their goals. So,
well, I think, Jason or Grant, I think that's a really important part of that communication, and that's sometimes the process of developing the goals can be just as valuable as the actual goals, because it leads to a whole lot of communication and discussion of what everybody wants out of a situation.
Well, Grant, I know you have one last answer for us before we kick it back to Carly. So what's your piece of advice that you give to producers here in March 2022, put on the billboard?
Yeah, I guess my billboard would be to allocate time to invest in yourself. I think it's very important to spend time and set aside time to work on this stuff, because we all get busy. Spring's coming. There's a lot of stuff going on. We've got all this checklist of things that we have to accomplish. But if you don't spend time on personal development and setting that time aside and allocating that, there's going to be a lot of other priorities that run over the top of your goals and what you need to do to focus on achieving them to have success in the future. So I think it's all about allocating time for yourself. Find a way to do that. Put it on your calendar, set yourself a reminder, whatever it looks like, but spend time on yourself.
Well said, Grant. Thank you so much. Look forward for you to stick around overtime.
I have one here. Says I've already developed. I feel like I've developed a lot of goals, but I'm having a hard time seeing the connection between actions and the goals. What do I do? And I think that's a pretty good question, and it's, I think, something that a lot of people struggle with a lot. When I was a professor and I taught strategic management, one of the things I spent a lot of time on was implementation of goals, and one of the reasons is because I thought that was a huge gap in what happens from classroom to implementation. And so I think we've all probably been through some kind of a strategic planning process somewhere in an organization, whether it be our farm or a community organization or whatever, and we've all been frustrated by the outcome of that process and felt like it was a gigantic waste of time. Be comforted to the fact that you haven't worked at a university and could see just how badly that can happen and how bad it can get. We'd spend months writing strategic plans, never to see anything come of it. And so the system I liked was something called the balanced scorecard. And what it does, and you can Google that, it'll help you start with a goal and then drive down to action. So say you have, as David said, an output goal. I want to hit this many bushels per acre. And then what are all the actions that you have to do in order to make it? And you start developing plans based upon that. Maybe I have to achieve planning by a certain date, and I have to have this quality of a stand. And how do I get this quality of stand? Well, I have, I don't want my employees, planning it over a certain miles per hour, and I want them checking this. There's all these kinds of things you can do, but it's a super powerful framework, and I highly recommend it for the people who really want to dig into that. I see another question. I don't know if any of you guys wanted to add anything to that. Another question: given all the uncertainty with the Ukrainian war, what do you think we should be thinking about in our operations? And that's a super good question too. David and I have talked about this a lot, and one of the things that we have concluded in our minds is that the range of potential outcomes is very, very wide here. And right now, the situation is very favorable for grain production and grain producers. And I think as we think about it, we have to realize that, do something to take advantage of some of that, but also realize that things could get a lot better. If we don't have a good crop in the United States this year, prices are going to be much, much higher. On the other hand, things could get a lot worse. And so, there's increasing tensions with China and other things. And, to the extent that times are really good now, things could go such that they become not so good really fast. And so I think that opens up a huge range of risk for us to think about. And so I think as risk managers, we really need to be thinking about what we're doing to manage the risk associated with growing what will, for all intents and purposes, be the most expensive crop any of us have ever grown in our careers.
Brent, to build off what you mentioned about bad things or good outcomes and bad outcomes, keep in mind 2 years ago, oil traded negative in April of 2020, and everyone was wondering, will ag commodity prices follow energy down? And now we've flipped the script, right? Energy prices is now headed towards, you can pick up the paper and find $200 a barrel any day of the week. That someone is on there talking about that. So recognizing how quickly things have changed and could change moving forward, I think is really important. The second piece here that I'll add is there has been the uncertainty around how the war will unfold. And then there's the uncertainty around how the sanctions will unfold and how those will adjust over time. And now we have this third and fourth level of uncertainty where what's going to happen with respect to domestic policy around ethanol or CRP or crop production. I think the takeaway here is we can't build a marketing plan around guessing what the third or fourth or fifth order impacts will be as to all this unfolds. It's almost impossible. It's always difficult to outsmart the market. Now it's just going to be completely impossible because all of these things, energy prices, grain prices, sanctions, currency flows, all of this is intertwined in ways where we can almost be guaranteed to not be able to accurately predict the outcome. And so how we need to make decisions in light of that is just go back to the basics, focus on base hits. Let's not try to outsmart the market, hit a home run. Let's just focus on base hits and make good decisions based on the information that we have today, and then update our thinking with any new relevant information that unfolds in the next few weeks or months or the rest of the year.
And I think, David, that's one of the hardest things, is that we are exposed to a torrent of information today. And there is so much information coming at us, and it's available to us kind of instantly on Twitter and other things. But I think it's really important to step back from that information every now and then and ask yourself, is that good information? Is that viable information? How confident am I that that information is accurate? And I think if you really push yourself on a lot of the things that we see, you find that you're being exposed to a lot of information that is, not that accurate and not that true, and it really and in either direction, and it can really mess with your decision making. And I think it's really important. So I'll tell you one practical thing I've done is I put a time limit on my Twitter. You can do it right there in your iPhone, and you can set it. And it's pretty surprising how rapidly you can burn through that. But it's really good discipline, I think. And I feel more confident and more better about the decisions I'm making, I think, than I did when you're just constantly reading about all the bad things going on in the world. David, I see the question, anything you're thinking about that we're not hearing about today, or what's on your mind that maybe is not kind of in the mainstream of things?
I think it's a great question. It's kind of dangerous asking an economist. There's lots of things that keep us awake at night, so you be careful what you wish for there. But I've been thinking about long-term interest rates. I think we've been hyper-focused on the Fed's next decision and what the Fed's going to do, what they did at this month's meeting, what they're going to do at the next month's or the next meeting that they have. And if you just step back and watch some of these long-term rates, like the 10-year Treasury, they've been trending higher, and they went up before the Fed raised rates, and they continued higher after the Fed raised rates. And I think that potentially has big implications for agriculture, and not just on the cost of borrowing money, but on asset values, both in agriculture and outside of agriculture. And so I think there's been a lot of attention on interest rates, but I think maybe that attention isn't necessarily placed in the right way, in the right place. And Brent, you and I mentioned this a lot. These implications are probably 2 to 5 year implications, and not necessarily 2022 implications. But we have to watch how 2022 unfolds, because that's going to set the pace for how this plays out for the next 5-10 years.
one thing I've been thinking about a lot, and it's just something that's on my mind, and it's something I think about, but it's not that actionable. It just concerns me, is the proclivity in times of rapid change for bad policy to get developed and discussed and implemented. And David, you were the first person that told me about it, and we wrote a little article about it. When inflation really started picking up, there's like a host of things people come up with to will stop inflation. Well, we should do price controls, or we should do rationing, or other things. They're really bad ideas, but it always tends to rear its head as these things start to unfold. And I think we're seeing it in agriculture today too. We need to repeal the RFS, or we need to open the RFS, or we need to open the CRP to cropping, or, I mean, these are bad ideas. And unfortunately, get more debate than they deserve. But I'm just very confident those are bad ideas. Okay, so what should farmers watch and plan for with the possibility of stagflation or inflation as things continue to evolve? Great question. Just as a definitional thing, stagflation is this idea that we end up with relatively high rates of inflation, low economic growth, and usually high levels of unemployment. At least the last time it happened, that's what we got. And so you get in a situation where you have less than full unemployment. The Fed usually wants to lower interest rates to help solve that problem, but they're stuck because we got a lot of high inflation, when the answer for that is higher interest rates. So you're kind of, get yourself in a corner where there's not a lot the Fed can do about it. Right now, we have the high inflation. We have really low unemployment. And so I don't think we're there yet. It appears we might be going there, certainly with the spike in energy prices. And it's an external spike. And again, last time we had this situation, we had the Arab oil embargo, kind of got things going, but the chain of events associated with that lasted for a long time. And I think right now, everybody is watching kind of the war on Ukraine unfold on their smartphone and thinking it's like a movie and it's going to be over soon. And we need to realize that the timeline for these kinds of things might be much longer than many of us are willing to want to contemplate. So I think how stagflation plays out, what do you do? Well, I think at the end of the day, I go back to the lesson we learned at the end of our podcast, Escaping 1980. We're supposed to write lessons to ourselves. And the lesson I wrote back to myself was the idea of don't get overextended on financial leverage, and do not try and act as countercyclical as possible. So what that's saying is there's a great temptation when things are inflating to really jump in and go and push your bets into the middle of the table, for instance, on land and other things. And that can work, but it can also put you in a risky position. So I think the key thing is understand what your goals are, where you want to be, right? So we focus our business on making decisions that move us towards our goals and not trying to outguess what the economic environment might do. So to answer your question, I would say be conservative, but focus on your goals and your business plans and try and tune it out as much as you can. But be aware that this is probably going to last for a while. Another question, how will inflation impact asset values? Is it good? Is it bad? What's the deal? As an economist, we generally dislike lots of inflation. And part of the problem with inflation is it changes prices rapidly. It makes people speed up economic behavior, and it tends to be self-reinforcing. And that's a problem. In that, I always said, Milton Friedman was made famous by saying inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, meaning it's all about the money supply. And he's kind of right, but he's also making a little bit simpler than maybe needs to be. It's a human condition, and as humans start to believe inflation exists, it cycles, and so we do more and more. It gets us into kind of an erratic behavior, and the only way to stop it is to break that cycle, and breaking that cycle is very painful. So the last time that cycle got broke was in the 1980s, and it took a massive recession to do it, and really high interest rates in a massive recession. So is inflation good? Well, for farmland values right now, they're going up, and they're driven in part by very high rates of inflation and relatively low interest rates.
I think, Brent, to add to that is one of the reasons why we had this webinar 2 months ago talking about what drives farmland values, and one of them is the expectation of earnings, and then also the interest rate environment. And so we have low interest rates, and so people are willing to bid of high value for assets to get those future earnings, and the earning expectations are really high. So inflation could really impact how we think those future earning streams are going to look like. But we also got to think about what happens on the other side of inflation, and that can be very painful to think through and navigate. So I'm always, I guess, we hear farmland is a good hedge for inflation. We hear that, I guess, that heuristic or that rule of thumb thrown out a lot. I think we just have to be careful with how we execute that and how we use that more broadly.
Carly, I'm not seeing any more questions. Grant, thank you very much. It's good to have a fellow Southwestern Nebraska person on the program. I enjoyed it and learned a lot from you. I appreciate you taking the time to share with us.
Yep. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been great to share, and I was excited for the opportunity, and it turned out well. So thanks for having me, and appreciate that.
Yep, and that'll do it for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender. Thank you, David, Brent, Grant, for leading today's conversation. And for you in the audience, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you online again next month.